Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly through the shadowed gates of an empire that once stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, and we follow a whisper, not a trumpet blast, not a grand parade, but a whisper that lingers behind silk curtains and carved wooden screens. You stand outside the towering walls of Topkapi Palace in the 16th century, the Bosphorus wind cool against your face, and somewhere deep inside those glowing windows, a wedding feast is ending. Laughter fades. Musicians lower their instruments. Oil lamps tremble in the dark. And you, dear listener, are about to witness what no one was meant to see. You probably wouldn't survive this, not because of swords or poison, but because in this world, intimacy itself is political, and a single stained sheet can decide a woman's fate. So, before we go any further, if this quiet space makes you feel even a little less alone, you can like the video and subscribe, but only if it feels right to your heart. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Are you lying awake in a quiet room at 2 a.m? Or maybe starting your day in a rainy city, eyes still heavy? Drop your time and place in the comments. Let's remind each other we're not alone out here. Now, dim the lights, let your shoulders relax, and let's begin tonight's slow, strange journey, together, here on Timeless Sleep. You step past the imperial gates, into the heart of the Ottoman court, where weddings are not about romance, but survival. Historically, Ottoman royal marriages were strategic alliances, especially in the early centuries, when sultans married daughters of powerful Anatolian or Balkan families to secure loyalty and prevent rebellion. Even later, when sultans favoured concubines over foreign princesses, the act of marriage still carried enormous symbolic weight. A bride entering the palace did not simply join a family, she entered a machine of dynastic continuity. Her body was not entirely her own. It was, in the most unromantic sense imaginable, an extension of the state. You can almost hear the unspoken rule echoing through the tiled corridors: purity equals legitimacy, and legitimacy equals stability. The feast has ended. Servants clear golden plates sticky with honeyed pastries. The bride, veiled in layers of silk, is led away by elderly attendants whose faces reveal nothing. You notice how young she is, perhaps 14, perhaps 16, which was not unusual in elite marriages of the period. In fact, across much of the early modern world, aristocratic brides married in their mid-teens, the Ottomans were hardly unique in that regard. But here, within these palace walls, youth feels sharper, more fragile. The girl walks slowly, henna staining her hands in intricate patterns meant to ward off evil. You wonder if henna can ward off anxiety. Probably not. There is a detail most official chronicles glide past: the expectation that the marriage be consummated immediately and that proof be presented. In many Mediterranean and Middle Eastern societies, as well as parts of Europe, the display of a blood-stained sheet after the wedding night served as evidence of virginity. The Ottomans inherited and adapted customs from Byzantine, Turkic, and Islamic traditions, blending them into their own court culture. While Islamic law itself does not mandate such theatrical proof, social expectations often filled the gaps between scripture and custom. And in the Ottoman palace, custom could be merciless. You follow the attendants through narrow corridors into the harem, a word that modern imagination tends to distort into fantasy, but which in reality was a strictly organised domestic space housing women of the imperial household. The harem at Topkapi was governed by hierarchy. At the top stood the Valide Sultan, the sultan's mother, one of the most powerful women in the empire. Beneath her were favoured consorts, then concubines, then servants. It was not chaos, it was bureaucracy wrapped in silk. The chief black eunuch, known as the Xlar Ars, oversaw much of its administration, a historical fact that often surprises people who assume the harem was hidden from male authority. In truth, it was deeply enmeshed in it. Tonight, though, all that structure tightens around one door. You pause outside the bridal chamber. Inside, candles flicker against Iznik tiles painted with tulips and geometric stars. The groom, perhaps a prince, perhaps even the reigning sultan, waits with a composure he has practiced. He has been raised for this moment, trained in statecraft, poetry and war. Yet this private ritual may determine how he is perceived by his court. Masculinity here is measured not just in battlefield victories, but in heirs produced. You imagine the absurd pressure. Forget awkward small talk. In this palace, the stakes are imperial succession. Outside the chamber, women wait. Not giggling bridesmaids, but stern matrons who have seen decades of palace intrigue. Among them may be midwives, experienced in recognizing signs of consummation. Their presence is not always physically intrusive, but symbolically it looms. You sense how thin the walls feel, how the air itself seems to listen. A quirky tidbit, whispered in later accounts, claims that in some cases musicians were instructed to play loudly outside elite wedding chambers to mask sounds and preserve modesty, an oddly tender detail in an otherwise tense ritual. Imagine that, a soft melody drifting through marble corridors while history holds its breath. Hours pass, or perhaps minutes that feel like hours. You notice how the empire's grandeur contrasts with the vulnerability of this single night. Ottoman chroniclers, such as those who served under Sultan Süleyman the Magnificent, a ruler whose reign marked the empire's golden age in the 16th century, recorded military campaigns and architectural triumphs in lavish detail. They described the construction of mosques by Mimar Sinan, the expansion of territories, the codification of laws, but when it came to the intimate mechanics of royal weddings, their pens grew cautious. Silence, you realise, can be deliberate. At last the door opens, an attendant emerges, holding folded linen. This is the moment whispered about in corridors and later erased from polite retellings. The sheet is examined. A stain, even a faint one, can bring relief. No stain invites scrutiny. You feel your stomach tighten, because the bride's reputation, her security, perhaps even her life in the palace, may hinge on biology's unpredictability. Modern medicine, of course, tells us that bleeding is not a guaranteed marker of virginity. The hymen varies naturally and can be affected by countless non-sexual activities. But in the 16th century, such nuance rarely tempered expectation. The state wanted certainty, even where certainty was impossible. If proof satisfied the waiting women, the sheet might be discreetly shown to senior figures, perhaps even to the Valid Sultan. It would not necessarily be paraded publicly in the palace courtyard. The Ottomans valued decorum, but the knowledge would circulate. Relief would ripple outward like the Bosphorus tide. The marriage stands validated. The empire sleeps easier. It sounds dramatic, but when succession crises could spark civil war, even symbolic assurances carried weight. You step back into the corridor, feeling the weight of that symbolism. The ritual is horrifying, not because it is uniquely monstrous. Similar customs existed in parts of medieval Europe, where sheets were displayed to families as proof of consummation, but because of its fusion with imperial politics. Here the private body is inseparable from the machinery of rule. The bride is not merely a young woman, she is a vessel for continuity. That pressure compresses the night into something almost unbearable. And yet, life in the palace continues. Servants whisper. Lamps are extinguished. Somewhere beyond the walls, fishermen cast nets into dark waters, unaware of the drama unfolding above them. You think about how empires often polish their public image, while quietly smoothing away the uncomfortable edges. Later Ottoman historians, particularly during the 19th century Tanzimat reforms when the empire sought to modernise and align more closely with European norms, would emphasise legal reforms, military restructuring, and administrative rationalisation. They would not linger on blood-stained linens. It did not fit the narrative of progress. Still, you cannot unsee the scene. The bride, now alone in a vast unfamiliar chamber, may feel triumph, fear, resignation, or perhaps simply exhaustion. The groom may feel pride or relief. Outside, the women who waited all night return to their quarters, their task complete. You sense how ritual creates the illusion of control over something inherently human and unpredictable. That illusion comforts rulers, it reassures courts, it tells the empire that order prevails. As you drift through these corridors, you realise the true horror is quieter than any dramatic retelling. It lies in expectation, in the way a young girl's worth could be compressed into a single physical sign. It lies in the state's intrusion into the most intimate moment imaginable, and it lies in the careful way later generations would try to forget, to edit, to imply that such things were exaggerated or misunderstood. Some were not. History is rarely clean. You pause at a window overlooking the dark Bosphorus. The water glints under moonlight, indifferent to palace rituals. The empire feels eternal tonight, its domes and minarets etched against the sky. But you already know, because you live centuries later, that no empire is eternal. Traditions that seem immovable can fade. Customs once defended as sacred can be quietly shelved. And whispers, even when suppressed, have a way of surviving. For now, though, you remain here in the 16th century, standing in a corridor heavy with incense and secrecy, aware that you have witnessed something the empire itself would later prefer you forget. The candles burn lower. Footsteps recede. Somewhere, behind another carved door, another young bride waits for her own night of judgment. And you, moving softly through shadow and silk, continue deeper into the palace, where power and intimacy intertwine in ways that will only grow more unsettling as our journey unfolds. The morning after does not feel romantic. It feels administrative. You wake, or rather, you remain awake, because sleep in the Ottoman palace is more suggestion than reality, to the soft shuffle of slippers against polished stone. The empire is already moving. Somewhere in the outer courtyards, janissaries drill in disciplined silence, a historical reality of the 16th century court where the elite infantry corps served as both military backbone and political force. Inside the harem, however, another kind of inspection is underway. What happened in that bridal chamber has now become a matter of quiet documentation. You sense how quickly something intimate transforms into something bureaucratic. The linen, folded hours earlier, has already travelled through hands trained not just in domestic care, but in palace protocol, and you begin to understand that this ritual was never simply about modesty or morality. It was about power, and more specifically, about proof. In the Ottoman worldview, legitimacy was fragile. The empire did not follow strict primogeniture like some European monarchies. Instead, all sons of a sultan were technically eligible for the throne. This meant that the birth of a prince was not merely a family celebration. It was a political event with consequences that could ripple across continents. A bride's virginity on her wedding night symbolized purity of lineage, a reassurance that any future child would be unquestionably tied to the dynasty. Even though Islamic jurisprudence emphasized legal marriage and paternity rather than theatrical evidence, court culture layered additional expectations onto those principles. You can almost hear the unspoken equation whispering through the marble halls. Uncontested bride equals uncontested heir, and uncontested heir equals fewer rebellions. In theory, at least. You walk through the tiled corridors again, noticing how the morning light softens everything. It almost makes the palace feel gentle. Almost. The Valide Sultan, mother of the ruler, may now be informed that the ritual proceeded as expected. Historically, the Valide Sultan often wielded immense influence, particularly during periods known as the Sultanate of Women in the 16th and 17th centuries, when powerful mothers and consorts shaped imperial politics behind the scenes. Figures like Sem Sultan and Hrem Sultan demonstrated that the harem was not merely a domestic sphere, but a political one. So when proof of consummation was presented, it was not idle gossip, it was intelligence. The Valide Sultan needed reassurance that alliances were secure, and that no whisper of impropriety could undermine her son's authority. You imagine her receiving the news with calm composure, perhaps offering a nod, perhaps murmuring a prayer of gratitude. No applause, just calculation. Outside the palace walls, weddings across the empire unfolded in simpler ways. Among ordinary Ottoman subjects, farmers in Anatolia, merchants in Damascus, craftsmen in Sarajevo, customs varied by region and ethnicity. Some communities displayed sheets publicly, others handled matters privately, and many relied more on trust than inspection. The empire was a mosaic of cultures, and not every practice in the palace mirrored the lives of common people. That's one of the most important mainstream facts about the Ottoman world. It was vast and diverse, spanning Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Kurds, Slavs, Jews and Turks. each carrying their own traditions. Yet at the centre of this diversity stood the court, where symbolism intensified. What might be a family matter in a village became a matter of state at Topkapi. You step into a small courtyard where fountains murmur softly. Water has always been important in Islamic architecture, symbolising purity and paradise. The Ottomans perfected this aesthetic, weaving tranquility into their spaces. It is almost ironic that such serene settings frame rituals so fraught with anxiety. You wonder how many brides stood beside these fountains before their wedding nights, staring into the water, trying to steady their breathing. Perhaps some were confident. Perhaps some were terrified. Perhaps most were simply resigned, aware that their personal feelings were secondary to dynastic necessity. A light joke flickers through your mind. Imagine trying to explain performance anxiety to an empire that controls 3 continents. No pressure at all. Yet beneath the formalities lies something more unsettling, the idea that purity must be proven. This concept was not uniquely Ottoman. In medieval and early modern Europe, aristocratic families sometimes required evidence of consummation to validate marriage contracts, especially when property and titles were involved. Royal courts in France and England occasionally witnessed bedding ceremonies where nobles escorted the couple to their chamber, symbolically affirming the union. The Ottomans, in their own way, were participating in a broader early modern obsession with lineage. Still, the palace environment amplified the stakes. A missing stain could trigger suspicion, suspicion could lead to interrogation, interrogation could spiral into disgrace. You hear whispers of cases where doubts arose, stories not loudly proclaimed, but murmured in corners. If a bride failed to produce the expected proof, explanations might be sought discreetly. Midwives could be consulted. In some accounts, alternative signs of consummation were considered, and sometimes the blame quietly shifted toward the groom, though rarely in ways that damaged his standing publicly. Gendered expectations were heavy, the burden leaned overwhelmingly toward the bride. A quirky tidbit circulates in later folklore. Some families in different parts of the empire reportedly prepared small vials of animal blood as insurance against humiliation. Whether this occurred in the imperial palace is debated, but the mere existence of such rumours reveals the pressure surrounding the ritual. When anxiety breeds contingency plans, you know the stakes are high. You continue walking, and the political dimension grows clearer. Marriage alliances in the early Ottoman centuries often linked the dynasty with powerful regional families. Though later sultans increasingly relied on concubines of enslaved origin, women brought into the palace through the devurm or slave systems, the emphasis on controlled lineage remained. Concubines who bore sons could rise dramatically in status, becoming Haseki Sultan, a title that conferred immense influence. Harem Sultan, for example, legally married Sultan Slayman, breaking earlier patterns and reshaping court dynamics. Her marriage itself signalled how evolving politics could alter tradition. But even then, legitimacy and purity narratives clung stubbornly to the edges of every union. The morning breeze drifts through latticed windows, carrying faint scents of rosewater. You pause to reflect on how the ritual also served as psychological theatre. By formalising proof, the court reinforced its own authority over biology. It declared that nothing, not even the mysteries of the human body, lay outside imperial oversight. In reality, of course, nature resists control. Not every bride bleeds, not every consummation follows expectation. Yet the ritual insisted on clarity. It demanded a symbol, even if the symbol simplified reality. You imagine the young bride now seated among senior women, her posture carefully composed. She may receive gifts, congratulations, perhaps even subtle shifts in how she is addressed. If the proof satisfied expectations, her transition from maiden to consort becomes official, recognised by the hierarchy of the harem. That hierarchy mattered deeply. Rank determined living quarters, stipends, and influence. In a court where proximity to the Sultan could translate into political leverage, status was everything. And so the sheet, that fragile piece of linen, functioned as a passport into a new level of authority. It is astonishing how much weight fabric can carry. At the same time, you sense the fragility beneath the ceremony. What if the ritual fails? What if doubt lingers? The empire's outward grandeur cannot fully mask the vulnerability of its succession system. In later centuries, succession struggles would erupt into open violence between brothers. Princes were once sent to govern distant provinces to gain experience, but this also allowed them to build rival power bases. Eventually, the practice shifted, and princes were confined within the palace in a system known as the kafes, or cage, to prevent rebellion, a historical development that reveals just how anxious the dynasty became about internal threats. Against that backdrop, even the symbolism of a wedding night took on amplified significance. You glance once more at the courtyard fountain, sunlight dancing across its surface. The palace hums with routine again. Clerks prepare documents. Courtiers rehearse etiquette. The empire's machinery grinds forward, steady and relentless. Yet beneath that rhythm lies the memory of last night's tension. You realise that the horrifying aspect of the ritual is not spectacle, but surveillance. The quiet understanding that nothing, not even the most private threshold of adulthood, escapes political scrutiny. It is control dressed as tradition, anxiety disguised as morality. And as you move deeper into the palace, following corridors that twist like the currents of the Bosphorus, you begin to sense that this ritual is only one thread in a much larger tapestry of fear and power. The sheet may have been inspected and folded away, but the logic behind it, the need to secure lineage at any cost, will echo through every birth, every rivalry, every whispered conspiracy. The Empire does not merely celebrate weddings, it audits them, it catalogues them, it absorbs them into its grand narrative of survival. You walk on, the echo of your footsteps blending with distant murmurs, knowing that the next chamber you enter will reveal not just the silent women who enforce these customs, but the intricate world that made such rituals possible in the first place. You drift deeper into the harem, where the air feels warmer, thicker somehow, scented with amber and rosewater, and you begin to understand that this world of women is not a chaotic fantasy, but a carefully ordered institution. The word harem simply means a forbidden or private space in Arabic, and in the Ottoman court it referred to the secluded domestic quarters of the imperial household, not a lounge of idle luxury as later European painters like to imagine. Historically, the imperial harem at Topkapi Palace housed hundreds of women at its height in the 16th and 17th centuries, including the sultan's mother, wives or consorts, children, servants and trainees. It functioned almost like a political academy wrapped in silk. Young girls, often brought from different parts of the empire or beyond through the slave trade, were educated in language, religion, music, embroidery, and strict etiquette. You picture them moving in quiet lines through tiled corridors, learning not only how to pour coffee without spilling a drop, but how to survive proximity to power. And survival, here, requires silence. The silent women of the harem are not voiceless, they are strategic. You notice how they communicate with glances, with pauses, with the subtle tilt of a head. Every gesture carries meaning. Rank defines everything. At the top stands the Valide Sultan, her authority recognised even by viziers. Beneath her are the favoured consorts, women who have borne sons and thus secured their position. Then come the Iqbals, women who have caught the Sultan's attention but not yet produced heirs. At the base are novices, called Kariyes, who train for years before even glimpsing the ruler. The hierarchy is rigid, but fluid enough to allow dramatic rises and catastrophic falls. A girl might enter as a servant, and one day become mother to a future sultan. Or she might fade into obscurity, married off to an official or sent away. You sense how the promise of elevation keeps the system running. Hope can be as powerful as fear. In this environment, the wedding night ritual you witnessed is not an isolated event, but part of a broader culture of supervision. The women themselves enforce it. Senior attendants prepare the bridal chamber, instruct the bride on expectations, and later inspect the linen. It is tempting to see them as mere instruments of patriarchy, but the reality is more layered. These women wield influence within their sphere. A chief attendant can make or break reputations. A whispered endorsement from a respected matron might protect a nervous bride. In a palace where men are physically absent from the harem's inner rooms, aside from the sultan and the eunuchs, Women regulate women. Power circulates in unexpected ways. You pass a lattice window overlooking a secluded garden. The light filters through geometric patterns, scattering shadows across marble floors. You imagine the young bride from last night sitting here now, surrounded by older women who evaluate her posture, her tone, her composure. They may offer advice in low voices, how to speak to the Sultan, how to manage jealousy, how to secure favour without appearing ambitious. It sounds like a masterclass in palace politics disguised as sisterly guidance. A quirky tidbit drifts into your thoughts. Coffee, introduced to Istanbul in the 16th century, became a staple of harem life, and women often gathered to drink it together, sharing stories and, inevitably, gossip. Imagine the caffeine-fueled analysis of last night's events. Even empires run on coffee. But beneath the surface of routine lies the memory of rituals that bind everyone to expectation. The harem's internal discipline is intense. Women cannot simply wander in or out. Eunuchs guard entrances, and movement is recorded. The chief black eunuch, often of African origin and holding immense administrative authority, oversees communications between the harem and the outside world. Historically, this position became one of the most powerful in the empire during certain periods, controlling access to the Sultan and managing vast charitable endowments. It is a reminder that the harem, though physically secluded, is politically connected. Decisions made here ripple outward into the empire's governance. You think again about the sheet, folded, examined, perhaps already forgotten by some, and you realise how many women were involved in that moment. A midwife might have stood by discreetly, an elder attendant might have verified the stain, another might have carried the news to the Valid Sultan. Each role is small, but together they form a chain of accountability. If doubt arises, these same women may question the bride gently but firmly. Was there resistance? Was there fear? Was there confusion? The line between care and surveillance blurs. You feel the tension in that blur. At the same time, the harem is not devoid of warmth. Children's laughter echoes faintly from another wing. Princes and princesses grow up here, under the watchful eyes of tutors and mothers. Education is rigorous. Princes learn calligraphy, theology, and statecraft, preparing for a future that could involve ruling an empire or, tragically, losing their lives in succession struggles. Daughters may later marry high-ranking officials, extending the dynasty's influence. The women of the harem oversee these early years, shaping personalities that will one day influence history. It is strange to think that behind the stern ritual of a wedding night lies a nursery filled with lullabies. You pause in a long corridor lined with Iznik tiles, their blues and reds still vivid centuries later. Architecture here is deliberate. Privacy is layered, courtyards within courtyards, doors within doors. This design reflects Islamic architectural principles of modesty and separation, but it also reinforces hierarchy. The deeper you go, the more restricted access becomes. Only a select few may enter the innermost chambers. The bridal chamber itself, last night's stage of tension, is just one room in this labyrinth. Yet its symbolism radiates outward. You consider how European travellers later described the harem with fascination and exaggeration. Many had never seen its inner workings, relying instead on rumour and imagination. Paintings depicted languid women draped across cushions, awaiting indulgence. The reality, as you now sense, is more structured, more disciplined, almost monastic in its rules. The wedding night ritual, stripped of fantasy, appears less like decadence and more like bureaucratic anxiety expressed through tradition. Still unsettling, but less theatrical than Orientalist art would suggest. A soft breeze stirs the curtains, and you catch fragments of conversation. Perhaps one woman recounts how years ago a bride failed to meet expectations and was quietly reassigned within the palace, her prospects dimmed. Another recalls a time when a particularly favoured consort used her influence to shield a nervous newcomer from scrutiny. These stories circulate like cautionary tales, shaping behaviour. Oral tradition within the harem becomes its own archive, preserving what official records omit. The empire may not document every ritual detail, but the women remember. You reflect on the emotional cost of living under constant evaluation. To enter the bridal chamber knowing that others wait outside, that linen will be inspected, that your future rank may hinge on an unpredictable physical sign, it is a pressure difficult to fathom. And yet, within this environment, resilience develops. Women learn to navigate expectations, to build alliances, to anticipate dangers. Some even leverage the system to their advantage. Hurrem Sultan, once a captive concubine, rose to become legal wife of Sulayman and a formidable political actor. Her ascent demonstrates that the harem could produce not only victims but strategists. As you continue walking, you notice a small door leading to a classroom where young girls practice reciting poetry. Their voices are soft but steady. Education here is not ornamental. It prepares them for potential influence. If one becomes mother to a prince, she must be capable of guiding him. The empire's future may depend on her wisdom. That thought adds another layer to the wedding night ritual. It is not solely about purity, it is about preparing the ground for future authority. The bride is evaluated not just as a body, but as a potential political actor. You step back into the corridor, feeling the hush settle around you like a veil. The silent women of the harem are custodians of continuity. They enforce rituals, yes, but they also sustain the dynasty's daily life. They manage budgets, oversee servants, arrange marriages and educate children. Their world is constrained yet influential, and within that world, the horrifying wedding night ritual becomes both a test and a threshold, a moment when a young woman crosses from obscurity into visibility, from trainee to participant in imperial destiny. The fountain's murmur returns faintly in your ears as you move away from the inner chambers. You realise that what makes this ritual so haunting is not only its intrusion into intimacy, but the collective gaze surrounding it. An empire of women, each bound by hierarchy, each aware that tonight it is one bride under scrutiny, but tomorrow it could be another. Silence becomes solidarity and surveillance at once. And as you walk onward, deeper still into the maze of silken shadow, you sense that the next layer of this story will pull you even closer to the linen itself, to the fragile symbol that carried so much weight within these walls. You find yourself back at the centre of it all, standing once more before the quiet gravity of the bridal chamber, because no matter how many corridors you wander, everything in this palace seems to circle back to that folded piece of linen. The blood-stained sheet tradition, whispered, denied, exaggerated, defended, lingers like incense in the air. It is both simple and immense, a physical sign meant to confirm what society assumes should happen on a wedding night. Historically, variations of this custom appeared across parts of the Mediterranean, the Balkans, and even medieval Europe, where families sometimes demanded proof that a marriage had been consummated. In the Ottoman imperial court, however, the symbolism carried additional political voltage. You are not just looking at fabric, you are looking at a document without ink, a certificate written in biology. The chamber itself feels deceptively gentle. Cushions embroidered with gold thread line the walls. A low bed rests beneath a canopy of silk, its curtains now tied back in the pale light of morning. If you close your eyes, you can almost imagine it as an ordinary room in an ordinary household. But this is not an ordinary household. This is the beating heart of an empire that, at its height under Sultan Sulayman the Magnificent, controlled vast territories across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. The Sultan's authority depends on lineage, and lineage depends on legitimacy. The sheet therefore becomes a small but potent assurance that the line remains unbroken. It is astonishing how something so intimate can be transformed into statecraft. You picture the moment again, the attendants waiting outside, the quiet exchange when the door opens, the careful unfolding of linen. There is no cheering, no dramatic display in a public square. The Ottomans prized decorum and modesty. Instead, the inspection happens within a controlled circle of senior women. If the expected stain appears, relief passes through the group like a silent wave. If it does not, tension tightens the room. The bride may be questioned gently at first. Was there fear? Hesitation? An injury? The midwife might offer explanations. You sense how quickly biology becomes negotiable, interpreted through the lens of expectation. Modern understanding tells you that bleeding on a first sexual encounter is not universal, that the hymen is not a reliable marker of virginity, and that countless factors can influence whether any visible sign appears. But in the 16th century Ottoman court, medical nuance does not carry the same authority as custom. The empire seeks certainty, even when certainty cannot be guaranteed. That gap between reality and expectation is where the horror resides. You imagine being the bride, aware that your body's response, something beyond conscious control, may determine your immediate standing within the palace hierarchy. No battlefield requires steadier nerves. There are accounts, some documented and others lingering in oral tradition, that suggest contingency measures existed in various societies to avoid humiliation. In certain regions of the broader Ottoman world, families reportedly prepared small cloths stained in advance with animal blood as a safeguard. Whether such practices ever touched the imperial palace directly remains debated among historians, but the rumour itself reveals the intensity of the pressure. When a culture builds a ritual around an unpredictable physical sign, ingenuity or desperation inevitably follows. You almost smile at the dark irony, empires that conquer continents undone by basic human anatomy. You walk slowly along the edge of the chamber, tracing your fingers lightly across carved wood. The ritual's defenders might argue that it protects women by affirming their honour, securing their position as legitimate wives. And, in a society where reputation shapes survival, that argument carries weight. A bride whose consummation is confirmed gains immediate credibility. Her future children, especially sons, enter the world without a shadow of doubt. In a dynasty where succession disputes have historically erupted into violence, even small assurances matter. The Ottoman system did not follow strict primogeniture, multiple princes could claim the throne, and in earlier centuries, brothers sometimes fought civil wars to secure power. Against that backdrop, clarity about maternal legitimacy becomes politically significant. Yet you cannot ignore the asymmetry. The groom's purity is rarely scrutinized with the same theatrical intensity. Masculine virtue, in this context, is assumed rather than tested. If anything, virility is celebrated. The bride, meanwhile, bears the burden of proof. The sheet becomes a one-sided examination paper, graded without appeal. You sense how deeply gendered this ritual is, how it transforms the female body into a public ledger. It is not merely about morality, it is about control. Control over lineage, over narrative, over the fragile boundary between private and political life. The women who conduct the inspection occupy a complicated position. They are enforcers, yes, but also participants in a system that grants them influence. A senior attendant who validates the sheet's evidence effectively certifies the marriage. Her word carries authority. In some cases, she may even shield the bride from harsher scrutiny, interpreting ambiguous signs in the most favourable light. Power here is subtle, negotiated through tone and timing. You begin to appreciate how the harem operates less like a prison and more like a tightly regulated institution where agency exists, though always within constraints. You imagine the bride sitting quietly afterward, perhaps offered sweet sherbet to steady her nerves. Her hennaed hands rest in her lap. The night has passed, the ritual completed. If all went according to expectation, congratulations will follow in muted tones. Her rank may shift, her quarters reassigned, her stipend adjusted. She crosses a threshold not just of marriage, but of status. The sheet, now folded and perhaps discreetly stored or destroyed, has done its work. It has spoken on her behalf in a language the court understands. But what of the brides for whom the ritual does not unfold smoothly? Historical records are sparse, yet hints suggest that doubts could lead to quiet consequences. A woman might find her influence diminished, her access to the Sultan reduced. In extreme cases, alliances could fracture. The empire, keen to avoid scandal, would likely handle such matters discreetly, but discretion does not erase emotional cost. You imagine the weight of suspicion, how it might linger like a shadow over future interactions. In a palace built on reputation, even whispers can wound. You step toward the window, letting sunlight spill across the floor. Outside, Istanbul hums with life, merchants bargaining in bazaars, sailors guiding ships along the Bosphorus, scholars debating theology in madrasas. The empire projects confidence and order. Yet within these walls, the fragility of that order becomes clear. The blood-stained sheet is a ritualized attempt to anchor legitimacy in something tangible. It reassures the court that the dynasty's foundation remains intact. But foundations built on symbols require constant maintenance. Each new marriage demands repetition. Each new bride faces the same silent examination. A light, almost irreverent thought crosses your mind. If only they had access to modern medical textbooks, entire corridors of anxiety might have been spared. But history rarely offers such conveniences. Instead, societies craft rituals to soothe uncertainty. Some rituals are benign. Others press heavily on those least able to resist. The Ottoman wedding night tradition sits somewhere in between, not uniquely monstrous compared to its contemporaries, yet undeniably intrusive. As you leave the chamber, you glance back one last time. The cushions are straightened, the canopy smoothed, the evidence removed. The room looks untouched, as if nothing extraordinary occurred. That, perhaps, is the final layer of the ritual's power. It leaves no permanent mark on the architecture, only on memory. The empire can continue presenting itself as dignified and orderly, its chronicles filled with conquests and reforms. The linen, once inspected, vanishes from official narrative. You step into the corridor again, aware that this fragile tradition is only one expression of a deeper fear, the fear of contested succession, of fractured authority, of chaos lurking beneath ceremony. The sheet may have been folded away, but the anxiety it represents remains woven into every marriage, every birth, every whispered conversation about heirs. And as you move forward, deeper into the palace's political heart, you sense that the next story waiting in these marble halls will reveal what happens when proof is questioned, when certainty slips, and suspicion begins to whisper louder than silk. You can feel it before anyone says it out loud, that subtle tightening in the air when certainty falters. The sheet has been inspected, folded, perhaps approved, perhaps quietly questioned. But what happens when the expected proof fails to silence doubt? You move through the palace with a new awareness now, sensing how fragile reputation can be in a court where whispers travel faster than decrees. The Ottoman dynasty, for all its grandeur, is deeply allergic to uncertainty. When lineage is the spine of power, even a faint shadow over a bride's purity can grow into something dangerous. And so, when sultans doubted the bride, or when doubt was planted by rivals, the consequences could ripple far beyond a single chamber. Historically, the Ottoman court was no stranger to suspicion. The empire's succession system, particularly before the 17th century, allowed multiple princes to compete for the throne, often resulting in brutal power struggles. Though the ritual of fratricide would later formalise the elimination of rival brothers, the anxiety that fueled it already simmered beneath the surface. In such an environment, legitimacy was currency. If a prince's mother carried even the faintest stain of scandal, political enemies might exploit it. You imagine a rival consort leaning close to the Valide Sultan, murmuring concerns in a tone sweet as honey and sharp as a blade. Doubt, once introduced, rarely leaves quietly. You picture a wedding night where the sheet emerges unstained, or where the stain appears ambiguous. The senior women exchange glances. A midwife is summoned. Explanations are offered. Perhaps the bride did not bleed. Perhaps the act was incomplete. Perhaps nerves interfered. Modern understanding would shrug at such variability, but in the palace, biology does not easily override expectation. The bride may be questioned gently at first, her voice trembling as she answers. Was she previously injured? Did she fall as a child? Did something happen before marriage? Each question, even softly asked, carries the weight of accusation. You feel your chest tighten imagining her isolation. If suspicion lingers, the matter might escalate discreetly. The Valed Sultan could be informed. The Sultan himself might hear a carefully worded account. Official chronicles rarely detail such intimate controversies, but court politics thrived on perception. In some cases across Ottoman history, women who fell from favour, whether due to jealousy, intrigue or perceived impropriety, found themselves reassigned within the palace hierarchy or married off to provincial officials. Exile did not always mean a dungeon. Sometimes it meant a quiet removal from influence. Yet in a world where proximity to the Sultan defined status, such removal felt catastrophic. You walk past a shaded alcove where two attendants speak in hushed tones. You imagine the scenario unfolding: a bride whose consummation failed to meet expectation might face subtle humiliation. Her quarters could be downgraded, her access to the Sultan reduced. Rivals might watch for any further misstep. In extreme cases, though rare and often filtered through rumour, accusations of impurity could lead to annulment. The Empire preferred discretion over spectacle, but discretion does not equal mercy. The horror here is not public shaming in a marketplace. It is the slow suffocation of reputation behind closed doors. There is also the possibility that doubt shifts direction. What if the groom is unable to consummate the marriage? Masculine inadequacy, though less openly scrutinised, could not be entirely ignored. In such cases, blame often settled on circumstance rather than character. Perhaps the Sultan was fatigued from campaign. Perhaps the timing was unfavourable. The narrative could be adjusted to preserve male authority. Gender expectations bend more easily for rulers than for brides. You cannot help but notice the imbalance. It is as if the sheet only ever truly tests one side of the bed. A curious tidbit circulates in some later Ottoman anecdotes. Certain palace physicians, trained in both Islamic and Greco-Roman medical traditions, were occasionally consulted in delicate marital matters. The empire's medical knowledge, influenced by scholars like Avicenna centuries earlier, included detailed understandings of anatomy and reproduction for its time. Yet even learned physicians operated within cultural frameworks but prized visible proof. Medicine might offer explanations, but custom often had the final word. Imagine being a palace doctor asked to mediate between biology and imperial expectation. No pressure there either. You pause by a window overlooking the Golden Horn, sunlight glinting on the water. The Empire looks serene from this height. Ships move steadily, merchants shout in distant markets, minarets pierce the sky with confident symmetry. Yet within these walls, a young woman's future can hinge on perception. If suspicion persists, alliances tied to her marriage may weaken. Families connected to her might feel slighted or defensive. In earlier centuries, when political marriages linked the dynasty to regional powers, such tensions could have broader consequences. Even in later periods, when concubines replaced foreign princesses as primary consorts, internal rivalries could ignite fierce competition for influence. You imagine a bride sitting alone after a night clouded by doubt. The silence presses heavier than accusation. She knows that every glance from attendants carries new meaning. Did they believe her? Did they interpret the evidence generously? Or are they merely waiting for instruction from above? In a palace governed by hierarchy, no one acts independently for long. Orders flow downward like water through channels. If the Valid Sultan decides the matter is closed, the tension dissolves. If she remains unconvinced, uncertainty lingers like a draught through marble halls. Historically, powerful women within the harem sometimes protected younger consorts from harsher consequences. The so-called Sultanate of Women demonstrated that female authority could rival that of Grand Viziers. Qasem Sultan, for example, acted as regent for her young sons in the 17th century, shaping imperial policy. In such an environment, a bride's survival might depend on winning the support of influential figures. The wedding night ritual, therefore, becomes not just a biological test, but a political audition. Pass, and doors open. Falter, and alliances must compensate. You begin to see how doubt itself becomes a tool. Rivals could weaponize rumours to undermine a competitor. Even if the sheet bore the expected stain, someone might whisper that it was staged. Human imagination requires very little evidence to ignite. The Empire's vast bureaucracy, with its scribes and record keepers, documented taxes and treaties meticulously, yet intimate suspicions thrived in oral circulation. Silence in official archives does not mean absence in lived experience. It often means deliberate omission. As you walk farther down the corridor, you sense how the architecture absorbs secrets. Thick walls hold conversations that never reach parchment. The horror of doubt lies in its invisibility. There is no public trial, no grand pronouncement. Instead, there is subtle erosion. Invitations not extended. Smiles withheld. Influence redirected. A bride might still bear children, still rise in rank, yet always wonder whether a shadow trails her. In a dynasty obsessed with legitimacy, even faint uncertainty can shape destinies. And yet, life continues. Another wedding will come. Another chamber will be prepared. The ritual will repeat, because repetition itself is reassuring. Each successful consummation, each approved sheet, reinforces the illusion of control. The empire convinces itself that lineage remains secure. But you, walking these halls with modern awareness, recognize the fragility beneath that confidence. No ritual can fully eliminate doubt. No inspection can guarantee future loyalty or prevent ambition. The sheet may silence immediate questions, but it cannot extinguish the deeper anxieties woven into Ottoman succession. You pause at the threshold of another courtyard, feeling the breeze cool against your skin. The sun has climbed higher now, casting sharp lines of light across the tiles. Somewhere, a call to prayer echoes softly, reminding you that faith underpins much of this world. Islam provided the legal framework for marriage, emphasizing contracts and witnesses rather than theatrical proof. Yet culture layered additional expectations onto religious law. The tension between scripture and custom flickers quietly in the background. As you stand there, you realize that doubt is the empire's constant companion. It lurks behind every celebration, every cradle, every coronation. When sultans doubted the bride, they were not merely questioning a woman, they were confronting their own fear of instability. And fear, once acknowledged, rarely disappears. It mutates, finds new rituals, new safeguards. You sense that the next layer of this story will reveal just how many officials and observers were drawn into these intimate verifications. How eunuchs, midwives, and attendants formed an uneasy circle around the bridal chamber, transforming privacy into procedure. You begin to notice how many people orbit a single closed door. The bridal chamber may seem like a private sanctuary, but in reality it is the centre of a carefully choreographed network of watchers, messengers, and interpreters. Eunuchs stand at corridor junctions, their presence both protective and supervisory. Midwives hover discreetly in nearby rooms. Senior attendants wait with folded hands, pretending calm while listening for subtle cues. The wedding night ritual is never truly between two people. It is a collective operation managed by an empire that distrusts chance. And as you move quietly through these tiled passageways, you start to see how the most intimate moments become administrative tasks performed by unlikely officials. The eunuchs, in particular, occupy a fascinating and unsettling role. Historically, the Ottoman court relied heavily on eunuchs to guard and administer the harem. The chief black eunuch, or Kslar Ars, controlled access to the women's quarters and often acted as an intermediary between the harem and the sultan. Many of these men were brought to the empire through the slave trade, castrated before entering palace service, and trained for years in discipline and protocol. Over time, some amassed extraordinary political influence, overseeing charitable foundations and advising on court matters. You imagine one standing outside the bridal corridor, face composed, posture rigid, aware that what unfolds behind the door may affect succession, alliances, and ultimately his own position. It is a strange irony, a man physically removed from reproduction, safeguarding the rituals that determine imperial lineage. History loves its paradoxes. The midwives are equally central. In a world before modern gynecology, experienced women carried generational knowledge about childbirth and female anatomy. They were summoned not only for births, but for moments of uncertainty. If doubt clouded the outcome of a wedding night, a midwife might be discreetly consulted to interpret physical signs. Her assessment could soothe suspicion or inflame it. You picture her entering the chamber with steady hands and calm authority, aware that her words carry weight beyond medicine. She does not write reports, she speaks, and others listen. In that moment, her expertise bridges biology and politics. There are whispers in some historical accounts that in certain elite households across different cultures, attendants sometimes waited just outside the bridal chamber to confirm that consummation occurred. In the Ottoman context, direct intrusion would have violated decorum, yet the symbolic presence of witnesses lingered. Music might play to mask sounds, servants might move about to create a buffer of normalcy, but everyone understood the purpose of the vigil. The ritual demanded verification, even if the verification remained indirect. You can almost hear the soft strumming of an oud outside the chamber, a melody designed to preserve modesty while quietly acknowledging scrutiny. It is oddly tender and deeply unsettling at the same time. You walk past a narrow staircase leading to an upper gallery where eunuchs once monitored movement within the harem. Architecture itself facilitated oversight. The palace was designed with layers of visibility and concealment, screens that allowed observation without exposure, corridors that funneled traffic past guarded points. This design reflects broader Ottoman architectural principles of privacy, yet it also underscores how privacy here is curated rather than absolute. Even the bridal chamber exists within a web of controlled access. The Empire does not trust unmonitored spaces. A quirky but telling tidbit floats into your awareness. Ottoman court etiquette manuals detailed everything, from how to bow before the Sultan to how to present a coffee tray without clinking porcelain. Precision mattered. Rituals reinforced hierarchy. In that context, the wedding night inspection fits naturally into a culture obsessed with procedural correctness. It is not merely a moral checkpoint, it is another box to be ticked in the grand ledger of imperial order. You almost imagine a bureaucrat somewhere, wishing there were an official stamp for the linen. Approved by the Empire, please file accordingly. Yet the human dimension remains raw. The bride, already navigating a maze of expectations, must now endure the knowledge that her body's response will be interpreted by a committee, however discreet. The groom, too, feels pressure, though less publicly scrutinised. Masculinity in the Ottoman court was tied to military prowess and the production of heirs. A sultan who fathered many sons reinforced his image as virile and favoured by destiny. If consummation faltered, explanations would be crafted carefully to preserve that image. Again, the burden tilts unevenly. The eunuchs and midwives may verify outcomes, but the narrative that emerges often protects male authority first. You pause in a shaded alcove where a fountain trickles softly. Water echoes through the marble like a heartbeat. You consider how these officials, eunuchs, midwives, senior attendants, form a protective ring around the dynasty. Their loyalty is rewarded with status and security, yet their lives are tightly controlled. Eunuchs cannot marry or father children. Their legacy lies in service. Midwives operate within boundaries defined by hierarchy. Attendants rise or fall with the fortunes of the women they support. Everyone's fate is intertwined with the outcome of nights like this. The ritual binds them together in shared secrecy. Historically, the Ottoman Empire prided itself on administrative sophistication. Its bureaucracy recorded land taxes, military appointments, and legal disputes with impressive detail. Yet intimate palace rituals rarely appear explicitly in official archives. Instead, glimpses emerge through memoirs, foreign observers, and later historians piecing together fragments. This absence is telling. The empire documented what it wanted posterity to see: conquests, treaties, architectural marvels like the Sulaymaniye Mosque. It did not emphasize the mechanics of bridal verification. And yet, the very need for eunuchs and midwives in these moments reveals how embedded the practice was. Silence in the archive does not equal non-existence, it often signals discomfort. You imagine a scenario where doubt arises despite the presence of witnesses. The midwife offers one interpretation, a rival consort suggests another. The eunuch relays information to the Valid Sultan with careful neutrality. Politics seeps into every sentence. If the bride comes from a powerful background, her allies may press for a generous reading of events. If she lacks strong backing, scrutiny may sharpen. The ritual, intended to secure certainty, becomes another arena for negotiation. It is almost theatrical, not in spectacle, but in subtext. As you continue walking, you sense the emotional toll on those tasked with enforcement. A senior attendant who has overseen dozens of weddings might grow hardened, viewing each bride as another step in the empire's cycle. Yet perhaps, late at night, she remembers her own wedding, her own fear. Empathy and duty coexist uneasily. The eunuch guarding the corridor may appear impassive, but he understands that a mismanaged situation could disrupt the delicate balance of power. The midwife, accustomed to blood and birth, knows that biology refuses to conform neatly to expectation. They all participate in maintaining the illusion of control. You reach a balcony overlooking the palace gardens. The scent of tulips drifts upward, vibrant and innocent. The empire outside these walls celebrates festivals, trades across seas, and wages wars with disciplined armies. Inside, a handful of officials ensure that the dynasty's most private threshold aligns with its public narrative. The wedding night ritual, seen through their eyes, is less about cruelty and more about continuity, though continuity enforced without question can still wound. And as you stand there, feeling the breeze brush against your face, you recognise that the circle of witnesses does not end with eunuchs and midwives. It extends to scribes who record births, to viziers who calculate alliances, to rivals who watch for weakness. The bridal chamber is merely the starting point. From it radiates a chain of oversight that reaches the throne itself. The Empire may try to erase or soften these details in later retellings, but the architecture, the roles, the procedures all whisper the same truth. Nothing about imperial intimacy was ever entirely private. You turn away from the balcony, sensing that the next layer of this story will carry you even closer to the throne, into the realm where politics invades the bridal chamber openly, where succession anxieties transform love, fear, and vulnerability into instruments of strategy. The eunuchs return to their posts. The midwives resume their duties. The attendants straighten cushions as if nothing extraordinary occurred, yet you know that every wedding night in this palace is a prelude to something larger, something far more dangerous than a stained sheet. You begin to feel it now, how the bridal chamber is not the end of the story, but the opening move in a much larger game. The cushions, the silk curtains, the careful inspection of linen, all of it is merely the prelude to politics that stretch far beyond the bed. In the Ottoman Empire, intimacy is never isolated from strategy. The moment a marriage is consummated, it transforms into potential succession, and succession is the most dangerous word in the palace. You walk slowly along a colonnade overlooking the inner courtyard, realizing that what seemed like a horrifying ritual is actually a cog in a machine built to protect a dynasty from itself. Historically, Ottoman succession did not operate on strict primogeniture, where the eldest son automatically inherits the throne. Instead, all legitimate sons of the Sultan were eligible. In earlier centuries, princes were sent to govern provinces as administrators, gaining experience and building loyalty among local forces. This practice strengthened their leadership skills, but also created rival power bases. When a sultan died, his sons sometimes raced toward the capital, each backed by factions eager to see their preferred candidate crowned. Civil wars erupted in the 15th century during such transitions, most famously after the defeat of Sultan Bayezid I in 1402, when his sons fought for control in a period known as the Ottoman Interregnum. You can almost hear the distant echo of those battles vibrating through the palace walls. Against that backdrop, the wedding night becomes less about modesty and more about preemptive damage control. You imagine the Sultan himself, perhaps still young, perhaps already seasoned by campaigns, understanding that the woman he has just married is not only a companion, but a potential mother of rivals. Every son she bears strengthens her position and complicates the future. In the harem's hierarchy, motherhood equals influence. A woman who gives birth to a prince gains status, resources, and leverage. If that prince eventually ascends the throne, she becomes Valid Sultan, the most powerful woman in the empire. So when the bridal sheet is examined and approved, it marks the beginning of a long, tense journey toward that possibility. The politics of the bridal chamber extend decades into the future. You pass beneath an archway where sunlight filters in thin blades, and you consider how quickly affection can become calculation. Perhaps the Sultan genuinely admires his bride. Perhaps he is indifferent. Either way, the court will evaluate her first and foremost as a vessel of succession. You sense how the language of love dissolves into the language of heirs. Even in moments of tenderness, ambition lurks quietly in the background. It is not necessarily cruelty, it is survival. An empire spanning 3 continents cannot afford ambiguity about who rules next. A curious detail about Ottoman court life surfaces in your mind. During certain periods, once a concubine bore a son, she was often removed from the sultan's bed, her primary role shifting to raising that child. This practice, sometimes described as 1 son per concubine, aimed to prevent any single woman from producing too many potential claimants and consolidating excessive influence. It is a reminder that the palace constantly recalibrated intimacy to maintain balance. Even affection was rationed strategically. You almost laugh softly at the absurd precision. Imagine trying to schedule destiny. You pause near a shaded fountain, where pigeons flutter briefly before settling again. The empire's anxiety about succession eventually hardened into law. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople in 1453, codified a controversial practice, allowing a newly crowned sultan to execute his brothers to prevent civil war. Though framed as a grim necessity to preserve order, it meant that every prince born into the dynasty carried both privilege and peril. In this context, the wedding night ritual takes on an even darker hue. The sheet does not merely certify purity, it clears the path for a future life that may end in fratricide. You feel the weight of that knowledge pressing against the serenity of the courtyard. Politics in the bridal chamber extend beyond birth to perception. Rival consorts watch each other carefully. If one woman's wedding night appears triumphant, another may quietly strategize. Alliances form among attendants, eunuchs, and even grand viziers who anticipate future power shifts. The sultan, though supreme in theory, is influenced by these currents. A favoured consort might whisper suggestions that shape appointments or policies. A Valide sultan might advocate for her grandson's interests decades before he sits on the throne. And all of it begins with that first night, when legitimacy is sealed. You imagine a scenario where a bride quickly becomes pregnant. Joy ripples outward, but beneath it lies calculation. The child's gender will matter immensely. A daughter may secure alliances through marriage. A son will ignite speculation about succession. The midwives who once verified consummation now oversee prenatal care, aware that every healthy heartbeat strengthens one faction within the palace. It is astonishing how swiftly private joy becomes public strategy. You picture attendants marking dates carefully, noting the timeline between wedding and conception, ensuring that no whisper of impropriety can gain traction. The bureaucracy of intimacy continues. There is also the possibility of tragedy. Infant mortality in the early modern world was high, even in royal households. A stillbirth or early death could shatter a mother's hopes and destabilise her position. In such moments, rivals might sense opportunity. The palace does not pause for grief, it recalculates. You feel a quiet ache, imagining a young woman mourning in silence while political eyes assess her diminished influence. The wedding night ritual promised stability, yet stability remains elusive. You lean against a cool marble column, reflecting on how the empire's structure transforms natural human milestones into strategic checkpoints. Marriage, consummation, pregnancy, birth, each stage is monitored, recorded, interpreted. The bridal chamber, once a place of vulnerability, becomes the first node in a network of surveillance, stretching from midwives to ministers. And yet, within that network, genuine emotions still flicker. Mothers love their children fiercely. Sultans sometimes cherish particular consorts deeply. Politics does not erase humanity, it entangles with it. A light, almost mischievous thought crosses your mind. If the palace had a motto, it might read, "Trust, but verify." Accept replace trust with dynasty, and verify with linen. The humour is faint, but it helps you breathe amid the tension. The Ottomans were not uniquely obsessed with lineage European monarchies, too scrutinised royal marriages intensely. Yet the Ottoman system's openness to multiple heirs amplified the stakes. Every birth created potential for both continuity and conflict. You step back into the corridor leading toward the inner council chambers, where viziers debate matters of war and taxation. Decisions made there will shape borders and economies, but they are subtly influenced by events in the harem. A Grand Vizier aware that a particular consort is rising in favour may adjust his alliances accordingly. Court politics are never confined to one wing of the palace. The bridal chamber whispers into the council hall. As you move forward, you sense that the horrifying wedding night ritual is less an isolated cruelty and more a symptom of a larger anxiety, the fear that power, once centralised, must be guarded relentlessly. The sheet, the midwives, the eunuchs, the silent women all serve the same objective, securing the dynasty's future. But no ritual, no matter how meticulously enforced, can eliminate rivalry or ambition. The empire will continue to wrestle with its own structure, sometimes violently. You glance back once more toward the harem's inner gate, realizing that every time a bride crosses that threshold, she steps into a web of expectations that extends far beyond love. Her wedding night is the spark, the blaze of politics follows. And as you continue deeper into the palace's shadowed heart, you begin to sense that the ultimate expression of this anxiety, the law that turned brothers into threats, is waiting just ahead, ready to reveal how far the empire was willing to go to protect the throne born from those very sheets. You feel the shift before you fully understand it. The bridal chamber, the sheet, the midwives, all of it suddenly seems like the gentler edge of something far more severe. Because once a prince is born, once legitimacy is secured and celebrated, the real tension begins. You walk toward the deeper chambers of the palace, where decisions are made not about weddings, but about survival, and you begin to confront the law that cast a long shadow over every cradle in the Ottoman dynasty, the law of fratricide. It sounds brutal, and it was, yet within the empire's logic, it was framed as a grim necessity, and disturbingly, it connects directly back to that first night of verification. Historically, Sultan Mehmed II, known as Mehmed the Conqueror, formalised the practice in the 15th century after witnessing the chaos of civil war among rival claimants. In his law code, he permitted a newly enthroned sultan to execute his brothers for the sake of order in the world. The phrase is chilling in its calmness. Order in the world. You stand in the quiet of the palace corridor and let that sink in. The empire that inspected wedding linens in the name of legitimacy also sanctioned the elimination of princes in the name of stability. The two are not separate ideas. They are chapters in the same story of fear. Fear of division. Fear of rebellion. Fear of losing control. You imagine the journey of a prince from birth to danger. His arrival is greeted with celebration. Cannons may fire in salute. Gifts flow through the palace. His mother rises in rank, her status secured. Yet from the moment he draws his first breath, he is both heir and threat. If his father dies and another brother ascends first, his own existence becomes perilous. In earlier centuries, princes were sent to govern provinces, gaining experience and forming alliances. This practice, while strengthening administrative skill, also intensified rivalry. Brothers sometimes gathered supporters, positioning themselves for a future contest. The civil wars of the 15th century proved how destructive that competition could be. Fratricide, as horrifying as it sounds, was intended to prevent prolonged bloodshed by eliminating rivals swiftly. You feel the cold rationality of that logic, pressing against your modern sensibilities. The empire believed that sacrificing a few princes could spare thousands of subjects from the devastation of civil war. It is a calculation that reduces human life to arithmetic, and yet, in its time, it was defended as pragmatic. The wedding night ritual you witnessed earlier ensured that each prince's legitimacy was unquestioned. The law of fratricide ensured that only one prince ultimately survived to rule. Legitimacy and elimination, two sides of the same coin. You walk past a small courtyard where young princes once played under watchful eyes. Their laughter must have echoed against these walls, innocent and unaware of the peril embedded in their future. You imagine a mother watching her sons grow, aware that their bond of brotherhood might one day fracture under the weight of succession. How does she sleep at night, knowing that the same ritual that secured her position could one day place her child in danger? The horror of the wedding night begins to feel like the prologue to a tragedy that unfolds years later. a mainstream historical detail drifts into your thoughts. During the reign of Sultan Mehmed III, in the late 16th century, 19 of his brothers were executed upon his accession to the throne. 19. The scale of it is staggering. Chroniclers recorded the event with a tone of solemn acceptance, emphasizing the preservation of order. You stand in the palace corridor and imagine the silence that must have followed. No public spectacle, no open debate, just the quiet removal of potential rivals. The empire absorbed the shock and moved forward. And yet, even within this harsh system, evolution occurred. By the 17th century, the practice of outright fratricide gradually gave way to confinement. Princes were kept within the palace in a secluded section known as the kafirs, or cage. This shift reflected changing attitudes and perhaps a growing discomfort with repeated executions. The kafirs spared lives, but introduced new psychological strain. Princes grew up isolated, cut off from administrative experience, sometimes emerging ill prepared to rule. The empire traded one form of instability for another. You sense how the anxiety never truly vanished. It simply changed shape. A curious, almost surreal tidbit lingers in some accounts. Princes confined in the kafirs sometimes developed eccentric habits, their isolation warping perception. Stories circulate of sultans who later displayed erratic behaviour, shaped by years of confinement. While such anecdotes must be treated carefully, they hint at the human cost of a system obsessed with control. The wedding night ritual sought to guarantee clarity. The law of fratricide sought to guarantee unity. Yet the emotional toll accumulated silently within marble walls. You pause near a carved wooden door that once led to council chambers. The decisions made here were immense. Declarations of war, alliances with European powers, administrative reforms, and always, hovering in the background, was the question of succession. A vizier, aligning himself with a particular prince, might calculate future advantage. A Valid sultan might maneuver to protect her son's claim. The bridal chamber, the cradle, the cage, they are all connected through invisible threads of strategy. You think again of the sheet. That fragile proof of purity ensured that a prince's birth could not be questioned. In a dynasty where rivals might weaponize any ambiguity, clarity at the beginning was essential. If a prince were later accused of illegitimacy, his claim could unravel. Thus, the horrifying wedding night ritual functioned as a preventive measure against future chaos. It was harsh, intrusive, and deeply gendered, but within the empire's framework, it served a purpose. The tragedy lies in how that purpose intertwined with lethal consequences down the line. You step into a dim corridor where light barely reaches the floor. It feels symbolic, the shadowed path from wedding celebration to fraternal rivalry. The empire's architects built for grandeur, yet they could not design away human ambition. No law, no ritual, no confinement could eliminate the fundamental tension of multiple heirs. Even with fratricide codified, conspiracies still formed. Even with princes isolated in the caves, factions still manoeuvred. Control remained an illusion, however meticulously enforced. A faint breeze carries the distant call to prayer across the palace. Faith and law intertwine here, though fratricide itself was not explicitly mandated by religious doctrine. It emerged from political necessity as perceived by rulers. That distinction matters. The empire's leaders justified the practice as a lesser evil, a grim choice in an imperfect world. Yet for the mothers and brothers involved, the abstraction of order must have felt hollow. You imagine a young sultan ascending the throne, burdened not only by authority, but by the knowledge of what must follow. The bridal chamber once promised continuity, now continuity demands sacrifice. As you continue walking, you realize that the horrifying wedding night ritual cannot be understood in isolation. It is part of a continuum that begins with proof of purity and ends, sometimes in the elimination of rivals. The empire sought stability through verification and control, yet stability remained fragile. The sheet certified legitimacy, the law enforced singular authority. Together, they formed a system designed to protect the throne at any cost. You pause at the edge of a courtyard bathed in late afternoon light. The palace appears serene, almost timeless. Tourists centuries later will wander these grounds admiring tiles and fountains, rarely sensing the quiet calculations that once shaped destinies here. But you, moving softly through this imagined past, feel the weight of it. Every wedding night carries the seed of future tension. Every prince born into celebration carries the shadow of competition. And as the light begins to soften, you sense that beyond these laws and rituals lies another layer of the story. The chroniclers who recorded some truths and omitted others, the quiet efforts to reshape memory itself. The empire not only managed succession, it managed narrative. And the whispers about sheets and brothers and cages did not always make it onto official pages. You begin to notice something quieter than ritual, subtler than law, the careful shaping of memory. The palace walls may hold echoes of wedding nights and whispered doubts, of princes born and brothers eliminated. But what survives in ink is another matter entirely. You walk through a chamber lined with manuscripts, imagining court historians bent over low desks, reed pens scratching carefully across parchment. The Ottoman Empire maintained an impressive bureaucratic tradition, recording conquests, decrees, endowments, and diplomatic exchanges with remarkable precision. Yet when it came to the intimate mechanics of bridal verification, or the emotional toll of fratricide, the official tone often shifted into restraint. You begin to understand that erasure does not always mean deletion. Sometimes it means selective emphasis. Historically, Ottoman chroniclers, such as those serving under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, focused heavily on military triumphs, architectural achievements, and the justice of the ruler. The court cultivated an image of order and divine favour. The construction of monumental mosques by architects like Mimar Sinan, the codification of law, and the expansion of territory were documented in glowing detail. These were the pillars of imperial identity. The bridal chamber, by contrast, did not fit easily into that narrative. It was necessary, but inelegant, foundational, yet uncomfortable, so it receded into the margins. You imagine a scribe pausing mid-sentence, considering whether to describe a wedding night ritual explicitly. Perhaps he chooses a euphemism. Perhaps he omits the inspection entirely, writing instead that the marriage was duly completed. The language smooths over texture. The empire appears seamless on the page, its rituals refined and unquestioned. You sense how power depends not only on controlling events, but on controlling how events are remembered. Silence becomes a tool as effective as proclamation. Yet stories persist in other forms. Foreign ambassadors stationed in Istanbul wrote letters home describing court customs, sometimes with fascination, sometimes with exaggeration. European travellers, barred from the inner harem, relied on rumour and imagination, producing accounts that mixed fact with fantasy. Some amplified the wedding night ritual into theatrical spectacle, while others hinted at practices the Ottomans themselves avoided documenting. The truth lies somewhere between discretion and distortion. You feel the tension between internal silence and external sensationalism. A curious tidbit surfaces from the edges of history. Certain palace memoirs and private correspondences, though rare, offer glimpses into the emotional world behind official decorum. While not detailing every ritual explicitly, they reveal anxieties about succession, rivalries among consorts, and the delicate balance of favour. These fragments act like cracks in polished marble, allowing you to peer inside. The empire may have preferred grandeur, but human vulnerability seeps through in personal notes and anecdotal recollections. You walk past a window overlooking the Bosphorus, the water shimmering under a pale sky. It feels symbolic, history flowing onward, carrying some truths while submerging others. In later centuries, particularly during the Tanzimat reforms of the 19th century, Ottoman leaders sought to modernise the empire and present it as rational and progressive in the eyes of Europe. Legal reforms, new administrative structures, and Western-inspired institutions emerged. In such an environment, older palace rituals may have been downplayed or quietly discontinued. Not necessarily because they were universally condemned, but because they clashed with the image of modernity. Memory was curated to align with aspiration. You consider how every empire edits its own story. Medieval European courts did not always dwell on bedding ceremonies or disputes over consummation in their grand chronicles either. Dynasties across cultures emphasized legitimacy and divine favor while minimizing messy details. The Ottomans were not uniquely secretive. They were consistent with a broader human impulse to present power as orderly and inevitable. Still, the deliberate softening of certain customs suggests awareness that these practices, while functional, were not flattering. As you wander deeper into the imagined archive, you picture a historian centuries later piecing together scattered references. A line here about verification, a hint there about suspicion, an ambassador's letter describing hushed rituals. The gaps between these fragments are as revealing as the fragments themselves. Absence becomes evidence of discomfort. You feel the weight of what is not said. The bridal sheet, once so urgently examined, dissolves into metaphor. There is also the role of oral tradition within the palace. The women of the harem, the eunuchs, the attendants, they carried memories that never reached parchment. Stories passed quietly from one generation to the next, shaping expectations and behaviour. A young bride might be warned in whispers about the scrutiny awaiting her. A senior attendant might recount how a past consort navigated suspicion skillfully. These narratives formed an unofficial archive, living and mutable. When the empire later attempted to present itself as refined and modern, such stories did not vanish. They retreated into private recollection. You pause beside a stack of bound volumes, imagining the Sultan commissioning histories that celebrated his reign. Chroniclers framed events to reinforce legitimacy. Even the law of fratricide, chilling as it appears to modern eyes, was justified in official discourse as a means of preserving order. Language transforms brutality into necessity. In the same way, the wedding night ritual could be framed as protection of honour rather than intrusion into privacy. Perspective shapes perception. A faint smile touches your thoughts as you consider how future historians debate these customs with careful nuance. Some argue that Western observers exaggerated Ottoman practices to reinforce stereotypes of exotic despotism. Others insist that palace culture did include strict verification rituals consistent with broader Mediterranean traditions. The truth likely lies in complexity rather than caricature. What matters is that the empire, aware of its global image, chose which aspects of itself to spotlight and which to dim. You step out onto a balcony where the city stretches endlessly beyond palace walls. Markets bustle, ships glide, calls to prayer weave through the air. The empire's public face is vibrant and confident. The private rituals that once unfolded behind carved screens rarely surface in celebratory narratives. And yet, they shaped lives profoundly. Brides faced scrutiny, princes faced peril, mothers navigated ambition and fear. The official histories may emphasize conquest and reform, but beneath them lies a quieter story of bodies and bloodlines. You realize that attempts to erase or soften these rituals do not fully succeed. Memory has a way of resurfacing. Scholars uncover overlooked documents. Folklore preserves hints of uncomfortable truths. Even architecture, the design of secluded chambers, the presence of guarded corridors, testifies to practices that required privacy and control. The palace itself becomes a silent witness. As you turn back from the balcony, you feel the layered weight of narrative. The horrifying wedding night ritual was never shouted from minarets, yet it was woven into the fabric of imperial continuity. Later generations may have preferred to focus on reforms and achievements, but the past resists complete sanitization. It lingers in footnotes, in whispered anecdotes, in the uneasy awareness that power often rests on rituals too delicate to display. You walk slowly through the corridor, sensing that the Empire's attempt to manage memory mirrors its attempt to manage succession. Both seek order, both confront unpredictability. The bridal sheet, the law of fratricide, the cage of princes, these are not isolated curiosities. They are interconnected responses to the same underlying fear of instability. And even if official histories glide past them, their shadows remain. Ahead, you sense another dimension of the story waiting, the way outsiders perceived these customs, sometimes distorting them into spectacle, sometimes misunderstanding their context entirely. The Empire may have tried to quiet certain narratives, but beyond its borders, imaginations ran wild. And as you step forward, you prepare to see how Western eyes transformed whispers into myth, adding yet another layer to the strange, slow journey you continue to trace through these marble halls. You begin to feel the centuries shifting beneath your feet. The marble corridors remain, the tiles still gleam in shades of cobalt and crimson, but the air changes. Time moves forward, and with it comes reform, anxiety, imitation, resistance. The rituals that once seemed immovable, the inspection of linen, the rigid choreography of witnesses, the silent calculations around succession, start to loosen at the edges. Not abruptly. Not with a proclamation that says, "We no longer do this." Empires rarely admit such things. Instead, change arrives gradually, disguised as modernization, refinement, necessity. You walk through the palace as the 18th, and then the 19th century unfold, and you sense the empire trying to reintroduce itself to the world. Historically, the Ottoman Empire entered a period of reform known as the Tanzimat in 1839, a series of administrative and legal changes aimed at centralizing authority and aligning the state more closely with European models of governance. The Glani Edict promised equality before the law and sought to rationalize taxation and military service. Bureaucracy expanded. Secular legal codes began to supplement religious courts. In this environment, certain palace customs that once felt essential began to appear antiquated. The empire was no longer only managing internal rivalries, it was defending its image in a world of embassies, newspapers, and foreign scrutiny. The bridal chamber, once sealed in secrecy, now existed in an age where rumour could cross borders swiftly. You imagine a reform-minded official walking these halls, aware that European diplomats view the Ottoman court through a lens tinted with scepticism and fascination. Orientalist paintings in Paris and London depict harems as exotic fantasies, languid women, idle luxury, mysterious rites. The empire, sensitive to how it is perceived, begins to tighten its narrative. Certain rituals are downplayed. Others are quietly retired. Not necessarily because moral awakening strikes like lightning, but because optics matter. An empire fighting to be seen as modern cannot afford to appear archaic. You move into a later era where sultans spend less time in Topkapi and more in newly constructed palaces along the Bosphorus, such as Dolmabahce Palace, built in the 19th century with heavy European architectural influence. Crystal chandeliers replace some of the older austerity. French-inspired salons appear beside traditional chambers. The very architecture signals transformation. In such spaces, the old choreography of wedding night verification begins to feel out of place. You sense how environment shapes behaviour. When rooms change, rituals adapt. A mainstream historical fact lingers here. By the 17th century, the practice of executing rival princes had already been softened into confinement within the cafes, and by the 19th century, even that system faced criticism for producing inexperienced rulers. Reformers argued for more structured succession rules, gradually reducing the brutal unpredictability of earlier centuries. As succession stabilised, the obsessive anxiety surrounding each individual prince's legitimacy diminished slightly. It did not vanish, but it no longer dominated palace life with the same ferocity. And as that anxiety eased, the wedding night ritual lost some of its political urgency. You imagine a 19th century Ottoman bride entering a chamber not entirely unlike those of her ancestors, yet sensing a different tone. The empire now prints newspapers. Telegraph lines stretch across provinces, diplomats dine in European capitals. The idea of publicly acknowledging something as intimate as linen inspection would feel embarrassing, even backward, to reformist elites. So the ritual becomes more private, less formalised, perhaps even symbolic rather than scrutinised. Silence shifts from concealment to obsolescence. A curious tidbit surfaces from this transitional era. Western medical ideas begin circulating more widely within the empire, particularly in urban centres like Istanbul. Medical schools incorporate European texts. Anatomical knowledge expands. While traditional beliefs remain influential, the rigid assumption that bleeding must accompany virginity starts to soften among educated circles. Not everywhere, not uniformly, but gradually. Knowledge, once restricted, seeps into perception. When biology is better understood, ritual loses some of its authority. You almost imagine a palace physician gently explaining variability, easing a tension that would have caused panic centuries earlier. You walk through a gallery where portraits of sultans hang in gilded frames. Their expressions shift subtly across generations, from stern conquerors to reform-minded monarchs dressed in European-style uniforms. Clothing changes, diplomacy evolves. The empire negotiates treaties, borrows ideas, adopts new technologies. Within this broader transformation, older customs fade not with a dramatic farewell, but with a quiet reduction in emphasis. The bridal sheet, once an object of scrutiny, becomes a relic of an earlier mindset. And yet, erasure is rarely complete. Traditions linger in private homes, in rural provinces, in communities far from reformist capitals. The Ottoman Empire, vast and diverse, does not change uniformly. In some regions, proof of virginity customs persist well into modern times, shaped by local culture more than imperial decree. The palace may modernise its image, but social expectations evolve unevenly. You feel the complexity of that truth. Reform at the top does not instantly transform behaviour at the bottom. As you stand near a window overlooking the Bosphorus, you sense how external pressure accelerates internal change. European powers frequently described the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe in the 19th century, questioning its stability and legitimacy. In response, Ottoman leaders worked to project rationality and progress. Emphasizing legal reform and administrative efficiency helped counter narratives of backwardness. Dwelling on intimate palace rituals did not. So memory shifts. The empire highlights what strengthens its diplomatic standing and lets other details recede. There is something almost tender about this gradual disappearance. No edict proclaims the end of the wedding night inspection. No public apology is issued. Instead, practice evolves quietly. A bride's worth becomes less tethered to a visible sign and more to her role within a changing society. The palace still values legitimacy, but legitimacy increasingly rests on documentation, lineage records, and political alliances rather than a single physical marker. Paper begins to replace linen as the ultimate proof. You reflect on how rituals rarely vanish entirely, they transform. The underlying concern, ensuring stability, preventing scandal, remains. But the methods shift to align with contemporary sensibilities. In the Ottoman case, modernization does not erase patriarchy or hierarchy, but it recalibrates how they manifest. The horrifying aspect of the earlier ritual softens into something less overt, more private, perhaps even optional. You sense a slow exhale moving through the palace. As twilight settles over the Bosphorus, you realise that the disappearance of such rituals is not simply moral progress or external imitation. It is adaptation. Empires survive by adjusting to new realities. What once felt indispensable becomes inconvenient. What once seemed honourable becomes awkward. The wedding night ritual, born of anxiety about legitimacy, loses relevance as other systems of verification strengthen. And yet, the shadows remain in memory, in rumour, in the architecture that once accommodated scrutiny. The carved screens, the guarded corridors, the presence of eunuchs, they testify to a time when privacy was tightly managed. The palace may no longer enforce the ritual with the same intensity, but its imprint lingers in stories and scholarship. You step back from the window, sensing that the next layer of this journey will carry you beyond the palace walls entirely, into the eyes of Western observers who, lacking full understanding, often exaggerated or misunderstood what they glimpsed from afar. As the empire reforms and rebrands, outsiders craft their own narratives, sometimes more sensational than the truth. And in that collision between internal reform and external imagination, the story of the wedding night ritual takes on yet another strange and distorted life. You step beyond the palace walls now, out into the wider world where stories travel faster than caravans, and imagination often outruns evidence. The Ottoman Empire, already layered with secrecy and ceremony, becomes a canvas for Western fascination. You can almost see it, European diplomats writing letters home from Istanbul, travellers publishing memoirs, artists painting scenes they were never permitted to witness. The harem, in particular, becomes a symbol, not of bureaucracy and hierarchy as you've come to understand it, but of exotic indulgence. And somewhere in that swirl of fantasy, the wedding night ritual is reshaped, magnified, misunderstood, or weaponized. Historically, European ambassadors stationed in Istanbul during the early modern period had limited access to the inner workings of the palace. The harem was strictly restricted, and even high-ranking male officials within the empire rarely entered its deeper chambers. Yet that absence of access did not dampen curiosity, it amplified it. Travellers like Lady Mary Wortley Montagu in the 18th century offered rare female perspectives on Ottoman women's spaces, sometimes challenging exaggerated Western assumptions. Still, many male observers relied on hearsay. The result was a blend of partial truth and elaborate speculation. You sense how quickly a private ritual, already discreet within the palace, could morph into something theatrical in foreign retellings. You imagine a European reader in Paris or London devouring tales of Ottoman weddings, described with dramatic flourish, veils torn away, crowds awaiting proof, ritualistic displays framed as barbaric spectacle. The reality, as you have walked through it, was quieter, more bureaucratic, less public. But nuance does not always sell. In an era when Europe defined itself partly in contrast to the Orient, highlighting perceived excesses or oddities of Ottoman culture reinforced a sense of Western superiority. The wedding night ritual, detached from its political context, could be portrayed as proof of despotism or backwardness. You feel the subtle distortion settling like dust over fact. A mainstream historical truth lingers here. Orientalism, particularly in the 19th century, shaped European artistic and literary representations of the Ottoman world. Painters such as Jean Langerme and Eugène Delacroix created lush scenes of harems filled with reclining women and dramatic intrigue. These works, though visually captivating, often reflected imagination more than documentation. The bridal chamber, in such art, became a place of spectacle rather than strategy. You sense how the original anxiety about legitimacy was lost beneath layers of fantasy. And yet, Western observers were not entirely wrong to note that proof of consummation customs existed in various societies, including their own. Medieval European bedding ceremonies sometimes involved witnesses escorting newlyweds to their chamber, symbolically confirming union. In some aristocratic circles, families expected evidence of consummation to validate marriage contracts tied to property and inheritance. The Ottomans were not uniquely obsessed with proof. They participated in a broader early modern culture of lineage verification. But in Western narratives, self-reflection was rare. It was easier to spotlight Ottoman rituals as exotic than to acknowledge parallels at home. You walk through a European salon in your imagination, listening to intellectuals debate the mysteries of the East. One describes a story of a sultan demanding public display of blood-stained sheets before cheering crowds. Another nods solemnly, never having verified the account. Sensational details spread because they confirm existing biases. The empire's own silence about certain practices creates space for embellishment. When official archives avoid explicit discussion, rumour fills the void. You sense the strange collaboration between omission and exaggeration. A curious tidbit emerges from the margins. Some European women who visited Ottoman bathhouses wrote admiringly of the solidarity and relative autonomy they observed among Ottoman women, challenging the idea that the harem was purely oppressive. Lady Montagu, for instance, described Turkish women as possessing freedoms in certain social contexts that English women lacked. These counter-narratives complicate the picture. The same society that enforced strict bridal verification also allowed elite women significant political influence, particularly during the Sultanate of Women. History resists simplicity. You stand at the edge of the Bosphorus once more, watching ships from various nations dock and depart. Trade routes connect Istanbul to Venice, Marseille, London. With each exchange of goods comes exchange of stories. The Ottoman Empire becomes both admired and criticised, feared and romanticised. The wedding night ritual, once a practical instrument of dynastic security, transforms into a symbol in Western imagination, sometimes grotesque, sometimes alluring, its political rationale fades behind aesthetic fascination. You consider how this distortion affects modern understanding. When people hear whispers of a horrifying Ottoman wedding ritual, they may picture theatrical cruelty rather than bureaucratic anxiety. They may imagine public humiliation rather than controlled inspection. The truth, as you have traced it, lies somewhere between discomfort and necessity. It was invasive, certainly, and deeply gendered. But it was not the carnival spectacle that some Orientalist narratives implied. Context tempers outrage without excusing intrusion. There is also the Empire's own response to Western scrutiny. As modernization accelerates in the 19th century, Ottoman elites become increasingly conscious of European opinion. Newspapers circulate in multiple languages, diplomats defend reforms in foreign capitals. In this climate, any custom that appears archaic risks becoming diplomatic liability. The wedding night ritual, already fading internally, becomes even less visible externally. Silence becomes strategic again, this time not to conceal from subjects, but to manage international image. You imagine a Western journalist pressing an Ottoman official about harem practices, seeking sensational detail. The official responds with polite vagueness, emphasizing family honor and modesty. The journalist returns home and fills gaps with imagination. And so the cycle continues. Partial truth meets narrative appetite. The bridal chamber, once a site of calculated privacy, becomes a projection screen for foreign fantasies. As twilight settles, you reflect on how easily cultural misunderstanding magnifies difference. Every society carries rituals shaped by its history and anxieties. When viewed without context, those rituals can appear monstrous or absurd. When examined closely, they reveal patterns shared across civilizations. The desire to secure lineage, protect reputation, maintain order. The Ottoman wedding night ritual, stripped of Orientalist embellishment, fits into that broader human story. You turn back toward the palace, its silhouette dark against the fading sky. The Empire tried to curate its memory, to highlight achievements and soften discomfort. Western observers tried to interpret what they could not fully access, sometimes exaggerating, sometimes misjudging. Between these narratives lies the layered truth you have been tracing, a truth that acknowledges both the intrusion of the ritual and the political logic that sustained it. And as the night deepens, you sense that the final stretch of this journey will carry you beyond the Ottomans entirely, into comparisons with other empires and traditions. Because the instinct to verify purity, to control succession, to manage memory, these are not uniquely Ottoman impulses. They echo across medieval Europe, across Asia, across centuries. The palace may have tried to erase certain details, and Western eyes may have distorted them, but the underlying themes are woven into the broader tapestry of human power. You begin to sense that the story you have been walking through, these hushed corridors, these folded linens, these anxious glances between attendants, is not confined to one empire. The Ottomans may have shaped their wedding night rituals according to their own political logic, but the instinct to verify purity and secure succession stretches far beyond Istanbul's domes. You drift outward now, across borders and centuries, and you realize that the bridal chamber has long been a stage upon which power rehearses its fears. The details change, the fabrics differ, the languages shift, but the underlying anxiety feels strangely familiar. In medieval Europe, for instance, aristocratic marriages were often public contracts, sealed not just by vows, but by witnesses. Wedding ceremonies were sometimes conducted in the presence of nobles, who escorted the couple to their chamber, symbolically confirming the union before withdrawing. In certain royal courts, consummation needed to be demonstrated to validate inheritance rights, particularly when property and titles were at stake. While not every marriage required physical proof in the form of a displayed sheet, the expectation that a marriage be consummated, and verifiably so, carried legal weight. You imagine a French or English noble bride feeling a similar pressure, aware that her worth is entangled with lineage and land. The setting differs from Topkapi, but the scrutiny feels parallel. You move further east in your mind, toward parts of South Asia and the Middle East, where variations of virginity testing customs persisted in different forms. In some communities, proof of bleeding was celebrated publicly, sometimes even paraded before family members. In others, it remained a private matter handled discreetly by female relatives. The intensity varied widely, shaped by local culture, religion, and class. The Ottomans did not invent the concept. They inherited and adapted it, weaving it into their imperial fabric. You feel the pattern emerging. This is not a single thread, but a recurring motif in human societies concerned with legitimacy. A mainstream historical observation anchors your reflection. Before the development of modern paternity testing, societies relied on social mechanisms to ensure that heirs were biologically connected to ruling families. In patriarchal systems where property and power passed through male lines, uncertainty about a bride's virginity could destabilize inheritance claims. Rituals, however imperfect, attempted to provide reassurance. Whether through public bedding ceremonies in Europe or discreet inspections in Ottoman palaces, the goal was the same: to reduce doubt in a world without dinar tests. It sounds clinical when phrased like that, almost pragmatic, yet the emotional cost was anything but neutral. You pause to consider a curious tidbit from medieval Spain and parts of Italy, where communities sometimes celebrated proof of virginity customs with music and communal acknowledgement. The sheet, once marked, could become a symbol of honour for the bride's family. The atmosphere might even feel festive. Compare that to the hushed bureaucratic tone of the Ottoman palace, and you see how context shapes experience. In one place, it is spectacle. In another, surveillance. Both rest on the same fragile assumption about biology. You imagine walking into a European castle chamber in the 14th century. Thick stone walls, a roaring hearth, nobles laughing outside as the newlyweds are escorted in. The pressure remains, though the aesthetic differs. A bride in silken lace may feel no less anxious than her Ottoman counterpart in embroidered kaftan. Across continents, women bear the burden of proof. Men's reputations hinge on virility, women's hinge on purity. The asymmetry repeats itself with stubborn consistency. As you trace these parallels, you also notice differences. The Ottoman system, with its unique succession practices and the law of fratricide, amplified the stakes surrounding legitimacy. In contrast, European monarchies often followed primogeniture, reducing competition among siblings, at least in theory. This distinction matters. Where only the eldest son inherits, verifying his legitimacy remains crucial, but rival brothers are less structurally empowered to contest the throne. In the Ottoman context, multiple eligible sons heightened anxiety. The wedding night ritual thus carried intensified political significance. Context again reshapes ritual. You let your thoughts wander further toward imperial China, where dynastic succession also depended on legitimacy, though practices differed. Concubines bore sons who might compete for favour, and court politics often revolved around maternal influence. While proof of virginity rituals did not mirror Ottoman customs exactly, the underlying obsession with lineage and maternal credibility resonates. Across empires, women in royal courts navigated a labyrinth of expectation, their bodies entwined with the state's future. The details shift, but the structure feels hauntingly consistent. A soft breeze brushes your imagined face as you stand at the crossroads of civilizations. You realise that focusing solely on the Ottomans risks missing the broader human pattern. Societies lacking scientific certainty about paternity constructed rituals to compensate. These rituals often targeted women disproportionately, reflecting deeper patriarchal assumptions. The horror lies not in one empire's cruelty, but in the widespread willingness to anchor political stability to a single biological sign. It is both ordinary and unsettling. Ordinary because it recurs so frequently, unsettling because it reveals how fragile trust can be when power is at stake. You reflect on how modern perspectives judge these customs with discomfort, sometimes outrage. And rightly so, the intrusion into intimate life is undeniable. Yet historical empathy asks you to see the context without endorsing it. Before reliable medical knowledge, before modern legal frameworks, societies relied on ritual to manage uncertainty. The wedding night sheet, whether in Istanbul or Florence, functioned as a visible answer to invisible questions. Its effectiveness was questionable. Its symbolism was powerful. A faint smile touches your thoughts as you imagine future historians analysing our own era's rituals with similar curiosity. What practices do we consider normal that may appear intrusive or absurd centuries from now? Perhaps we too anchor legitimacy in symbols that future generations will find perplexing. The human impulse to codify trust has not vanished, it has simply evolved. As you turn your gaze back toward the silhouette of the Ottoman palace in your mind, you feel a sense of continuity. The horrifying wedding night ritual you first encountered is no longer isolated. It belongs to a larger tapestry of dynastic anxiety woven across cultures. The Ottomans tried at times to soften or erase aspects of it. Western observers exaggerated or misunderstood it, but at its core, it reflects a universal tension between intimacy and power. You begin to sense that the journey is nearing its quiet end. The corridors have grown familiar. The fountains murmur with softer insistence. What remains now is not spectacle or accusation, but reflection. Why do some rituals fade while others endure? Why do certain memories retreat into shadow while their emotional residue lingers? The Ottoman wedding night tradition, shaped by politics and biology, may have diminished with modernization, but its echoes persist in stories, scholarship, and cultural memory. You step forward gently, aware that the final layer of this journey will not introduce new horrors or new laws. Instead, it will ask you to sit with what you have seen, the sheets, the whispers, the cages, the chronicles, and to let them settle into a broader meditation on power and silence. You slow your steps now, not because the palace demands it, but because the story itself begins to soften at the edges. The corridors that once felt tense with scrutiny seem quieter, almost reflective. You have walked through wedding chambers and council halls, past eunuchs and midwives, through laws of fratricide and archives of omission. The horrifying wedding night ritual that first drew you here no longer stands alone as a shocking anecdote. It has unfolded into something more layered, a window into how power manages fear, how intimacy becomes policy, how silence can be as deliberate as proclamation. And now, as evening settles gently over the Bosphorus, what remains is not outrage, but understanding tinged with melancholy. You stand in a courtyard where the marble has cooled under fading light. The fountain's murmur is steady, patient, almost timeless. Empires rise and recede, yet water keeps moving. The Ottoman dynasty once believed that inspecting a bridal sheet could anchor legitimacy, that codifying fratricide could preserve unity, that controlling narrative could sustain dignity. In many ways, these strategies worked. The empire endured for over 6 centuries, a remarkable feat in any era. That is the mainstream historical truth resting quietly beneath the drama. Longevity requires adaptation, and adaptation often involves rituals that feel strange, even harsh, to those who come later. And yet, as you let your breath slow, you sense that what lingers most strongly is not the ritual itself, but the human faces behind it. The young bride waiting in candlelight, hands stained with henna, heart beating against the weight of expectation. The senior attendant balancing empathy with duty. The eunuch guarding a corridor, aware that silence is part of his service. The mother watching her sons play, knowing that succession could turn love into rivalry. These individuals moved within a system larger than themselves. The sheet, the law, the chronicle, they were tools. The people were the ones who carried the emotional burden. You think about how memory works. The Ottoman court, like many empires, curated its image. It celebrated architectural triumphs, military victories, legal reforms. It softened details that clashed with evolving ideals. Western observers, in turn, amplified certain aspects into spectacle. Between erasure and exaggeration, the truth settled into fragments. What remains today is a mosaic assembled by historians, scholars, and storytellers who piece together archives and anecdotes. The wedding night ritual survives not as a daily practice, but as a question. What does it reveal about the intersection of privacy and power? There is something almost tender in the way the ritual faded. No grand decree abolished it with thunderous applause. Instead, modernization shifted priorities. Legal reforms replaced symbolic proofs. Succession stabilized through clearer rules. Medical knowledge reduced superstition. The linen that once carried political weight became just fabric again. The silence around it transformed from concealment into irrelevance. That is how many customs end, not with revolution, but with quiet redundancy. A soft breeze moves through the courtyard, carrying the distant hum of the city beyond palace walls. Istanbul continues, layered with centuries of memory. Tourists wander through Topkapi today, admiring tiles and jewels, perhaps unaware of the whispered anxieties that once animated these spaces. The palace stands as a museum now, its chambers open to daylight and cameras. The bridal rooms that once held secrets are labelled with placards. Time has gentled them. The horror has thinned into history. You reflect on the broader pattern you traced, how societies across continents crafted rituals to manage uncertainty. Before modern science, before legal standardization, proof often took symbolic form. The Ottomans were neither uniquely cruel nor uniquely enlightened. They were human, navigating power with the tools available to them. Recognizing that does not require approval, it invites perspective. Judgment softens into contemplation. The fountain's rhythm slows your thoughts. You imagine the young bride from centuries ago stepping into her chamber, unaware that her night would echo through time as part of a larger narrative about empire and erasure. She likely thought only of surviving the moment. History rarely announces itself while it is happening. It whispers, accumulates, and only later does it reveal its patterns. You let your shoulders relax, feeling the marble beneath your fingertips. The story you walk through was never just about a sheet. It was about the fragile architecture of legitimacy, the lengths to which rulers go to secure continuity, the quiet costs borne by those closest to power. It was about how memory is shaped, what is polished and what is dimmed. And perhaps, most gently of all, it was about how time transforms even the most charged rituals into distant echoes. The palace grows quieter in your imagination. Lamps flicker in distant rooms. The Bosphorus reflects the last silver threads of dusk. You realize that every empire believes its systems are necessary, even inevitable. Yet centuries later, those systems appear strange, sometimes unsettling, sometimes almost incomprehensible. That is the humility history offers. What feels absolute in one era becomes anecdote in another. You take one final look across the courtyard. The carved screens no longer guard secrets, they filter sunlight for visitors. The corridors no longer vibrate with succession anxiety, they echo with footsteps of tourists. The wedding night ritual, once enforced with solemn vigilance, has dissolved into scholarship and story. And still, the deeper questions remain relevant. How much of our private lives do we surrender to collective stability? How do we balance trust and verification? What rituals today will future generations examine with raised eyebrows and quiet disbelief? The night deepens gently, your breathing slows with it. The empire you explored recedes into silhouette, its edges softened by time. What once felt horrifying now feels human, flawed, anxious, adaptive. The silence that once concealed now comforts. The fountain continues its steady murmur, a reminder that history flows onward, carrying both glory and discomfort in equal measure. You allow the image of the palace to fade gradually, like a lantern dimming at the end of a long corridor. The sheets are folded away, the doors are closed, the whispers settle into stillness, and you, having walked through centuries of tension and transformation, feel the weight lift slightly from your chest. The story has not vanished, it has simply found its place among countless others that shape our understanding of the past. The Bosphorus glimmers once more in your mind, calm and indifferent, reflecting stars that watched all of this unfold long before you arrived, and will continue long after. The empire sleeps, the rituals rest, and you can let your thoughts drift now. Slow and steady, carried by the quiet assurance that history, however strange, is part of a shared human journey.